Before the world wakes up and noise takes over everything, there is a brief, almost sacred silence that most people never truly notice. In that quiet space before dawn, when even the wind feels still and time seems to pause, something deeper begins to surface inside the human heart. It is not loud, and it does not compete with thoughts. It appears only when everything else slows down enough for it to be heard. In that place, where the mind stops running and the soul is no longer trying to control everything, a different kind of awareness begins to rise. It feels ancient, familiar, and yet easily forgotten in daily life. This is the space where Psalm 23 begins to come alive in a completely different way, not as words memorized or repeated without thought, but as something experienced from within. The statement, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," is often known, but rarely fully understood. It is easy to hear it as comfort, yet it carries something far more confronting than comfort alone. It challenges the deeply rooted belief that life can be fully managed through personal effort, planning, and control. Modern life encourages constant movement. The mind is trained to solve, improve, secure, and predict everything. There is a hidden pressure in this way of living, a quiet exhaustion that builds over time. People may not always notice it, but beneath the surface, there is a constant effort to hold life together through control. Time is managed, outcomes are planned, identity is carefully shaped, and uncertainty is treated as something to eliminate rather than accept. Yet beneath all of this effort, something begins to weaken internally. No achievement fully satisfies it. No amount of success removes the inner tension completely. This is because the human soul was never designed to carry the weight of total control. And in that realization, the words, "The Lord is my shepherd," begin to take on a deeper meaning. A shepherd is not distant. A shepherd does not offer suggestions from far away. A shepherd leads directly, takes responsibility, and guides the path of the one who follows. To accept this image is to accept something uncomfortable, that one is not fully in control. It requires acknowledging limitation, vulnerability, and dependence. For the modern mind, this can feel like weakness because independence is often seen as strength. But in this psalm, the meaning is reversed. "I shall not want" does not mean that life becomes free of difficulty or lack. It means that the inner condition of desire begins to change. The soul starts to shift away from constant craving and begins to recognize that what it truly seeks cannot be obtained through material accumulation or external achievement. There is a deeper hunger beneath all surface desires, and it is not easily satisfied by what the world offers. In this quiet realization, something begins to loosen. The pressure to secure everything starts to lose its hold. Trust begins to replace control, not as escape from responsibility, but as a different way of living within it. And as this shift begins, the psalm moves from idea into experience, where guidance is not theoretical, but deeply personal and ongoing. As this deeper understanding begins to settle in, another truth quietly emerges within the human experience. A large part of modern anxiety is not actually caused by real lack, but by the belief that everything must be constantly secured through personal effort. The mind stays active because it assumes responsibility for outcomes that are never fully within its control. This creates a subtle but constant inner tension, where even in moments of rest, the thoughts continue to work in the background. The human heart often believes that peace will come once everything is under control. Once life is organized, once uncertainty is reduced, once every outcome is secured. But this assumption carries a hidden problem. Life never fully allows complete control. There is always something unpredictable, something uncertain, something just beyond reach. And because of this, the mind remains in a cycle of effort that never fully ends. In this context, the words of Psalm 23 become more than spiritual language. They begin to challenge the very foundation of how life is approached. "The Lord is my shepherd" is not just a comforting phrase. It is a redefinition of responsibility itself. It suggests that the weight of guiding and securing life does not rest entirely on the individual. A shepherd does not abandon the sheep to figure out the path alone. A shepherd takes responsibility for direction, protection, and provision. This means that following requires trust, but it also means release from the illusion that everything depends on personal control. And this is where resistance naturally appears, because letting go of control feels unfamiliar in a world built on self-management. To say, "I am the sheep," is to accept limitation. It is to admit that human understanding is not complete, and human strength is not sufficient to carry everything alone. This is not a denial of responsibility, but a reordering of it. Life is still lived, decisions are still made, but the pressure to control every outcome begins to loosen. "I shall not want" continues this transformation in a quiet but powerful way. It does not describe a world without challenges. Instead, it describes a soul that is no longer defined by constant desire and fear of lack. Something changes in the inner orientation of the heart. What once felt urgent begins to lose its dominance. What once felt necessary begins to be seen more clearly. A deeper awareness begins to form, one that recognizes that much of human striving is driven not by real need, but by insecurity. The fear of not having enough, not being enough, or not securing enough creates a cycle of constant movement. But when trust begins to replace this fear, the internal pressure starts to decrease. This does not mean life becomes passive. It means life becomes less dominated by anxiety-driven control. Actions still happen, plans are still made, but they no longer carry the same emotional burden of needing to guarantee outcomes. A quiet shift takes place, where trust becomes the foundation rather than control. In this way, the psalm does not remove responsibility from life. It redefines how that responsibility is carried. And as this understanding deepens, the relationship between the soul and the shepherd begins to move from concept into lived experience, where guidance is no longer distant, but continuously present in the unfolding of life itself. As this inner shift continues, the psalm moves deeper into a contrast that becomes impossible to ignore. "The Lord is my shepherd" stands directly against the illusion that a human being can fully control, secure, and direct their own life without consequence. It quietly exposes how much of modern living is built on the assumption that mastery over every area of life is not only possible, but necessary. Yet beneath this assumption lies a growing exhaustion. People often do not recognize it immediately, but there is a kind of fatigue that comes not from physical effort alone, but from the constant mental demand to stay in control. Every decision feels important, every outcome feels like it must be managed, and every uncertainty feels like a problem that must be solved immediately. In this state, even rest is not fully rest. The body may stop, but the mind continues processing, analyzing, and planning. This is why many people feel tired, even after periods of pause. The deeper issue is not activity itself, but the inability to release the internal pressure of control. The psalm introduces a different structure for understanding life. A shepherd leads. A shepherd does not merely advise from a distance or provide information without involvement. A shepherd actively guides the path, takes responsibility for direction, and ensures the well-being of the one who follows. This changes the role of the individual from controller to dependent traveler. This is where the resistance becomes strongest. The idea of being led challenges the modern identity built on independence. Dependence is often misunderstood as weakness, but in this context, it becomes the condition for release. It is not about losing dignity or value. It is about acknowledging limitation and stepping out of the burden of self-sufficiency. When the psalm says, "I shall not want," it begins to reveal a shift that is not external but internal. It is not the removal of all lack from life, but the transformation of how lack is experienced. Desire begins to lose its constant grip. The soul starts to recognize that much of its restlessness comes from the belief that it must constantly secure more in order to feel safe. This realization slowly changes the relationship with desire itself. What once felt urgent begins to feel less controlling. What once felt necessary begins to be seen more clearly. The inner pressure to accumulate, achieve, and secure everything begins to soften. A deeper truth starts to surface. Many of the fears driving human behavior are not based on immediate reality, but on imagined futures. The mind constantly projects scenarios of loss, failure, or insufficiency, and then reacts as if they are already happening. This creates a continuous state of inner tension, but when trust begins to enter this space, something shifts. The future is no longer treated as something that must be controlled in advance. Instead, it becomes something that can be approached with openness rather than fear. This does not remove responsibility, but it removes the illusion that responsibility means total control. In this way, the psalm does not offer escape from life, but a different way of carrying it. The shepherd does not remove the journey, he redefines how the journey is walked. And as this understanding deepens, the soul begins to move from resistance into the beginning stages of surrender, where life is no longer seen as something to control entirely, but something to be guided through with trust. As the psalm continues, the meaning of surrender becomes clearer, but also more challenging. The Lord is my shepherd is not simply a comforting idea to hold during difficult moments. It is a reorientation of how life itself is understood. It shifts the center of responsibility away from constant self-direction and places it into a relationship of guidance and trust. This is not an abstract concept. It directly confronts how the human mind naturally operates. Left on its own, the mind tends toward constant movement. It analyzes, compares, predicts, and replays. Even in quiet environments, thoughts rarely stop fully. There is often an internal noise that continues beneath the surface, as if the mind is always trying to stay ahead of life. Because of this, the idea of being led does not immediately feel peaceful. It feels unfamiliar. The mind is trained to believe that safety comes from control, not from surrender. Yet the psalm suggests something different, that constant control may actually be part of what creates inner unrest. When it says, "He makes me lie down in green pastures," the language is deliberate. It does not describe a gentle suggestion, but an active intervention. The sheep does not always choose rest on its own. In the same way, the human mind does not naturally settle into stillness without resistance. It tends to remain engaged, even when exhaustion is already present. This is why life sometimes includes moments where striving is interrupted, not always in ways that feel comfortable, but in ways that prevent the soul from continuing in unsustainable patterns. At times, this happens through silence, where external noise fades. At times, it happens through disruption, where plans do not unfold as expected. And at times, it happens through the collapse of systems that once felt secure. From a human perspective, these moments can feel like setbacks, but within the logic of the psalm, they can also be understood as redirection. The shepherd is not only concerned with movement forward, but with the condition of the soul being led. If constant striving becomes harmful, then rest becomes necessary, even if it is not chosen voluntarily. Green pastures are not simply about comfort in the usual sense. They represent a place where life is simplified enough for the soul to stop overworking itself. It is a space where survival is no longer driven by excess pressure, but by provision that is already present. In this space, the soul begins to relearn that it does not need to constantly overextend itself to remain safe. Yet this kind of rest can feel unfamiliar. Many people are so used to stimulation, activity, and mental engagement that stillness can feel uncomfortable rather than peaceful. Silence does not hide what is within. It reveals it. And for this reason, stillness can initially feel unsettling. However, this discomfort is part of the process the psalm is describing. The shepherd does not avoid it. Instead, he leads through it. Because only when the mind slows down can the deeper condition of the soul be seen clearly, and only when it is seen clearly can it begin to be restored. In this way, green pastures are not an escape from life, but a recalibration of how life is experienced. The soul is not being removed from responsibility, but from the pressure of constant inner unrest. And as this begins to settle, another movement of the psalm begins to unfold, where rest leads naturally into restoration, and stillness becomes the doorway to deeper healing. As the psalm continues to unfold, rest is no longer the only focus. It begins to move into something deeper, something more internal and transformative. He restores my soul marks a shift from external guidance to inner repair. This is not a surface-level comfort, but a process that reaches into the deepest layers of human experience. Restoration implies that something has been affected over time. The human soul carries experiences that slowly accumulate weight, regret that lingers longer than it should, fears that remain quietly active in the background of thought, attachments that tighten without being noticed, and the quiet exhaustion that comes from carrying hopes, disappointments, and expectations all at once. None of this is always visible on the outside, but internally it shapes how a person thinks, reacts, and perceives life. Over time, it creates a kind of invisible burden that influences even ordinary moments. The psalm does not ignore this condition. Instead, it directly addresses it through the idea of restoration. But this restoration is not mechanical or immediate. It is not about fixing behavior or adjusting external circumstances. It is something deeper. It is the gradual reordering of the inner life, where what has become fragmented is slowly brought back into unity. Thoughts, desires, fears, and identity itself begin to be realigned. This process is not rushed. It does not operate on surface-level changes. It reaches beneath appearances, into the structure of how a person understands themselves and the world. In this way, the soul is not simply repaired, it is reshaped. Yet, this restoration does not happen in isolation from difficulty. The psalm does not separate healing from challenge. Instead, it acknowledges that transformation often occurs while life is still complex and uncertain. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death introduces this reality without hesitation. The valley is not described as optional. It is presented as part of the human journey. It represents seasons where clarity is lost, where control is weakened, and where certainty is no longer available in the same way. These are moments of transition, where illusions that once felt stable begin to dissolve. However, it is important that the psalm calls it the shadow of death, not death itself. A shadow cannot exist on its own. It only appears when something else is present nearby. This subtle detail changes the meaning of the valley. It is not absolute absence, but a space where something greater is still present, even if not immediately visible. In this valley, fear becomes a natural response, but the psalm introduces a turning point. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. The focus shifts from external conditions to presence. It is no longer only about what is happening, but about who is present within it. This shift is significant because it redefines fear itself. Fear does not disappear simply because circumstances improve. It loses its dominance when the sense of being alone is broken. Presence becomes more powerful than situation. The valley does not end immediately, but its meaning changes. It is no longer interpreted as abandonment. It becomes a place where trust is refined rather than destroyed. And as this understanding deepens, the psalm begins to reveal that even in difficulty, guidance, protection, and presence remain active, leading the soul forward into a different kind of stability that is not dependent on external conditions. As the psalm reaches its deeper layers, the language begins to move from survival into something far more sustaining. The valley is no longer the final focus, because the presence within it changes everything. I will fear no evil, for you are with me becomes the turning point where experience is no longer defined by what surrounds the person, but by who remains with them inside it. This shift is not based on circumstances improving. In fact, the circumstances of the valley do not disappear immediately. What changes is the internal understanding of what those circumstances mean. Fear begins to lose authority not because danger is removed, but because isolation is no longer assumed. The soul is no longer interpreting life as something it has to endure alone. The psalm then introduces symbols that deepen this understanding. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. These are not passive objects. They represent both correction and guidance, strength, and direction. The rod speaks of protection and discipline, while the staff speaks of guidance and care. Together, they show that divine involvement is not one-sided comfort, but active shaping of the path. What is striking here is the idea that correction itself is described as comfort. This challenges a common human assumption that comfort only comes through ease. In this framework, even correction carries meaning because it prevents greater harm. What may feel restrictive in the moment can actually be protective in the long run. This leads into another powerful image. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. The setting does not remove opposition. It does not erase conflict or eliminate tension. Instead, it introduces provision within it. The table represents nourishment, stability, and communion, placed directly in the middle of an unchanged environment. This is a major shift in perspective. It means that well-being is not dependent on perfect conditions. Life does not need to be free of opposition in order for the soul to be sustained. Instead, sustenance is presented as something stronger than surroundings. What is given internally is not controlled by what is happening externally. Even more importantly, identity begins to shift away from environment and toward provision. The presence of enemies no longer defines the outcome. The focus moves to the one who prepares the table. This creates a quiet but profound stability where external tension no longer has the final word over internal peace. Then the psalm moves into another layer. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Here, identity and abundance are no longer just supported, they are redefined. Anointing represents being set apart, recognized, and healed. It is not something earned through effort, but something received. In a world where identity is often built through comparison and achievement, this introduces a radically different foundation. Identity as something given, not constructed. My cup overflows continues this idea, but expands it. It is not just about having enough, but about abundance that exceeds containment. Yet this overflow is not only material, it is internal. It speaks of a soul that is being expanded in its capacity to hold meaning, presence, and grace without being overwhelmed. And finally, the psalm closes with continuity. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. This is not passive accompaniment, but active pursuit. Goodness and mercy are described as following, chasing, remaining engaged with the soul throughout every season, whether awareness is strong or weak, whether clarity is present or not. The final line, I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever, is not only an ending, but a culmination. Dwelling is not temporary, it is permanent belonging. It represents a state where the soul is no longer moving in and out of insecurity, but resting in sustained presence. Seen as a whole, the psalm is not just comfort, it is a structured journey. It moves from control into trust, from anxiety into presence, from fragmentation into restoration, and finally into lasting belonging. And at its core, it leaves one quiet realization. Peace is not achieved through control, but through surrender into a presence that does not fail.